ready?
Yeah!
This is the Ross Kaminsky Show.
You're a great American.
Now, Ross Kaminsky.
Come on, man.
On Denver's talk station, 630 KHOW.
All right, good morning. It's Wednesday. I'm Ross. Thanks so much for spending some time with me. We've got a very interesting show coming for you today on a really crazy wide range of topics. Everything from Facebook pressing down political content in a feed. We got Ross and the Rabbi today. We've got Miss Colorado 2021 is going to join the show. And she's actually an intelligence analyst in the United States Army. And we're going to talk about something she's doing coming up in the very next segment of the show, less than half an hour from now. You may have heard this or seen this in the news, but there was a boy who is 16 years old. He's a swimmer in Colorado Springs. He swims for Coronado High School, and he's diabetic. And he's got an implanted blood glucose monitor. And he was recently disqualified from swimming because he had his monitor, which he needs to wear. And since he was part of a relay team, his whole team was disqualified. And Igor Rakin, education and civil rights attorney who's been on the show before, is going to join us to talk about his representation of that young man. So we have a lot to do. Now, yesterday afternoon, and this falls distinctly into the category of I watched so that you don't have to. I watched Joe Biden's speech about Afghanistan. And there are a couple things I would say about that speech. One is, if we were having a big national debate about whether we should get out of Afghanistan or not, then that could have been potentially an interesting speech. But the big argument in the United States right now is not really that. We were already drifting towards getting out of Afghanistan. President Trump was on his way to doing that, and President Biden did it. It didn't matter which one of those guys ended up winning the presidency. We very likely would have been out of Afghanistan. The question is just, how would it have been done? So that's one thing about the speech. It appeared to be addressing the wrong question. The other thing that I noticed right off the bat about the speech, when you're going to come on TV and talk to your country as president of the United States about a very traumatic thing that just happened with 13 fantastic young Americans having been killed in a suicide bomb that was arguably made possible by the president's own bad decision-making. You would think that he would come out with a combination of things, but let's say a quiet humility mixed in with some determination. I mean, he can't, as president, he can't just come out and say, I did it all wrong. They don't do that. You know, Trump never apologized for anything, and so far Biden hasn't either. But there's a certain tone that I would have expected in this speech. Not groveling, perhaps, just trying to be realistic about what to expect. Not groveling, but with a bit of humility. And instead, he came out. My gut reaction to it was, he came out as if he was speaking to someone who was criticizing him, and he felt upset and defensive and was pushing back against someone who was criticizing him. Now, I understand why he might feel that way, because almost everybody has been criticizing him. But it's a bad look for a president standing there speaking to the country to look angry and defensive.
In April, I made a decision to end this war. As part of that decision, we set the date of August 31st for American troops to withdraw. The assumption was that more than 300,000 Afghan national security forces that we had trained over the past 2 decades and equipped would be a strong adversary in their civil wars with the Taliban. That assumption that the Afghan government would be able to hold on for a period of time beyond military drawdown turned out not to be accurate. But I still instructed our national security team to prepare for every eventuality.
I don't know. Maybe I'm projecting, but especially at the beginning of this.
In April, I made a decision to end this war.
There's just something about the tone of that. And I fully admit my bias that I don't like Joe Biden and I think he's gotten Americans killed. But as I was watching that, I really was kind of taken aback right away by his tone. It was angry, aggressive, and defensive. And I just thought it was a miss. Just like every one of his speeches lately about what's happened in Afghanistan has been a miss. Even folks who normally defend him have been critical of these speeches. They've all been bad. They've all been bad. Now, you might expect a conservative place like the Wall Street Journal to criticize Joe Biden's speech, which is definitely worth criticizing. And I will get to some stuff that the Wall Street Journal had to say about it. But what's perhaps more interesting was a piece from Politico. Politico, slightly left-leaning, right? Not as bad as many, but slightly left-leaning. Certainly nobody's idea of a conservative outlet. It's mainstream media that does as well as mainstream media can try to do to not let their liberal bias be blindingly obvious. And it's not as bad as the New York Times and the Washington Post. It's just sort of establishment liberal. By the way, Politico is being purchased by a giant German media conglomerate called Axel Springer for $1 billion. Not bad for the Politico people. Anyway, the Politico headline, Biden tries to shift blame on Afghanistan. That's a really interesting headline coming from a place like Politico, right? You wouldn't think much of it if it were in National Review or The Spectator. But in Politico, Biden tries to shift blame on Afghanistan. The president vehemently, and that's a good word because you could hear that in his speech, he was angry and aggressive and defensive, like I said. The president vehemently defended his decisions surrounding the withdrawal of U.S. troops, brushing off criticism about the way the war ended. Now, again, listen to this, keeping in mind where it was published. President Joe Biden said Tuesday that he took, quote, responsibility, end quote, for his decisions on Afghanistan. As for any mistakes he made, well, he offered plenty of potential culprits. The 100-plus American citizens who didn't make it out, they were notified 19 times with multiple warnings and offers to help them leave in Afghanistan all the way back as far as March, he said, adding that most of them were dual citizens anyway. The fall of Kabul, far earlier than most intelligence and military advisors predicted, Biden pointed the finger at the Afghan army and said he'd instructed his team to prepare for that eventuality. By the way, the Afghan army lost 60-something thousand people, most of them in very recent times. Plus, he had to withdraw quickly because of the deal that his predecessor, former Donald Trump, cut last year with the Taliban, he said, and some errors were simply avoidable. He argued the bottom line is there is no evacuation from the end of a war that you can run without the kinds of complexities, challenges, and threats we faced. Biden emphasized in roughly 30-minute speech, none. Despite those errors, Biden declared the U.S. evacuation of more than 120,000 people from Afghanistan was an extraordinary success. Those are Biden's words. He spent no time dwelling on his own broken promises, including a vow to fly out any U.S. citizen who wished to leave, and instead delivered a defiant address to close out America's longest war, defending his handling of the exit, pointing to corruption and malfeasance in the Afghan government that the U.S. spent far too long supporting, slamming his critics as downplaying the cost of the armed conflict and arguing the country must move past the war on terror that began almost exactly 20 years ago. Biden's remarks served as the latest instance of the president digging his heels in on Afghanistan in the face of an unprecedented wave of criticism from traditional allies in the Democratic Party and the media. In fact, Biden has appeared more resolute and defensive the louder his critics became, appearing convinced that voters in history will ultimately reward him for ending the war despite the chaotic withdrawal. All right, I'll stop with Politico there. You get the point. That last part, rather interesting. Is Biden's political calculus that if he just gets up and lies louder and just keeps saying the same stuff over and over and does it louder and louder, which also seemed to be Donald Trump's theory of presidential communications, that he'll get away with it, even though, by the way, Donald Trump really didn't. Donald Trump lost his reelection bid, arguably because enough of the public, remember, it was a very close-fought thing, that election, enough of the public didn't trust Donald Trump, and he lost in a narrow election. Does Joe Biden think, this is what Politico is suggesting, that he can come out and issue this vehemently defensive speech and the multiple vehemently defensive speeches, and that he'll later just be rewarded for it because he will have ended the war? I guess that's his best hope right now. I don't see it that way, but that much might just be projecting my hope, right? I don't want him to be rewarded. I want him gone. I want the Democrats gone. I want Kamala Harris gone. And I don't say that because I love the Republicans. I say that because today's Democrats are a really scary socialist, out of their minds bunch who need to go. The Wall Street Journal put it this way: American presidents must make hard decisions, and we're inclined to support them when they do so overseas in the national interest. But President Biden's defiant, accusatory defense on Tuesday of his Afghanistan withdrawal and its execution was so dishonest and so lacking in self-reflection or accountability that it was unworthy of the sacrifices Americans have made in that conflict. Wow, that's a good little paragraph right there. The charitable interpretation is that this is what Mr. Biden really believes about Afghanistan in particular, war in general, and how to defend the United States. The uncharitable view is that he and his advisors have decided that the only way out of this debacle is to lie about it, blame everyone else, and claim that defeat is really a victory. Doesn't that sound a lot like what happened over the previous 4 years? And like I said, it didn't work out too well for the previous guy. And the previous guy, by the way, really only aggressively pissed off Democrats who probably weren't going to vote for him, and just enough independents to cause him to lose. Whereas Biden is pissing off not only every Republican, but pretty much every independent and lots of Democrats. So Biden's doing it way worse. The Journal says, again, the charitable interpretation, maybe Biden really believes this stuff. The uncharitable version, maybe he just decided that politically his best way out is to lie and blame everyone else and claim that defeat is really a victory. The Journal continues, neither one is reassuring about Mr. Biden's character, his judgment, or most ominously, the long 3.5 years left in his presidency. I couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. I still wonder, and people haven't really gotten into this much yet, and I understand why, given what was going on in Afghanistan until some hours ago. But you gotta wonder what this means politically for Biden. A year is an immensely long time in politics. 3 years and change is forever. So it would be a fool's errand to predict what will happen in the 2024 presidential elections. There's just no way to know. Plus, Donald Trump is such a huge wild card, right? I mean, if Donald Trump were the Republican nominee, you have to think all of a sudden that the Republican chances of winning that election are much lower than they would be with anybody else. I know Trump supporters don't want to hear that, but it's definitely true. Any other Republican would have a much higher chance of beating Joe Biden than Donald Trump would. So that's a big wild card. And we don't know what else will happen in the world. Is there going to be another war that causes people to rally around a president sometimes? Is there going to be an economic downturn that would hurt Biden? We just don't know. But in the shorter term, coming up to, well, first of all, we've got a couple of gubernatorial elections in this country in 2 months. New Jersey, I don't think the Republican has any chance. I don't even know who the Republican candidate is. But there was just a poll that came out of Virginia that had the Republican candidate less than 1 point behind the Dem. And if you still believe that polls misunderestimate Republican support, you might be thinking the Republican might be ahead in Virginia. And this is not just any Democrat in Virginia. This is Terry McAuliffe, right? Close friend of the Clintons, previous governor, huge Dem fundraiser, not particularly tarred by scandal like a lot of other candidates are, but just an annoying, he's just sort of a gross. I saw when I said his name, Shannon kind of cringed. Shannon didn't look like he felt angry as much as he looked like he felt dirty just from hearing the name. And that's how I feel about McAuliffe. He is the swamp creature. But he's in Virginia. And remember, Northern Virginia is all lobbyists and defense contractors, and it is all, Washington, D.C. It's just the upper class people from Washington, D.C. They live in Northern Virginia and suburban Maryland near D.C. So those are government people. You get farther to the south, it's quite different. You get down by Richmond and down by Virginia Beach, where the Atlantic Fleet is and all that. You get a lot more Republican voters. But this is a state that has paralleled Colorado's path. Virginia went from red to purple to fairly deep blue, very much like Colorado did. And if a Republican, especially one that the Democrats are trying to say is too Trumpy, can win in Virginia, this would be just an earthquake, a massive political earthquake. Democrats are probably already scared. They'd be pooping their pants if that happened. We'll be right back with Igor Rakin.
KHOW Denver, 630 KHOW, an iHeart radio station. Available everywhere on our free iHeart Radio app. #1 for music, radio, and podcasts.